The first time I saw him, he didn't speak. He never had. People whispered about the boy as if silence was a disease, something contagious, unnatural. They called him the quiet one, the shadow in the corner. But they never understood what his silence really meant. Because silence, in its purest form, is not absence, it is awareness. And he was watching. Always watching. It was late, the kind of night where shadows curve into corners, thick and suffocating. The adults in the house were arguing, voices sharp like knives cutting through the fragile air. And there she was. She moved differently. Not just walking, but commanding. A presence that didn't just fill the room. It rewrote it. I saw it first, before the boy did. But then I noticed his eyes. Black, unblinking, fixed. And in that moment, I realized the boy was about to break his silence. What he saw, it wasn't something ordinary. It was a betrayal older than memory, older than the walls themselves. She held power in her hands, though no one else could see it. Not yet. And the boy understood something primal, something that would forever separate him from the rest of the world. The truth can't be spoken lightly. It comes at a cost. And the cost is everything you think you know about yourself. No one else would notice the shift. No one would remember the way the air thickened, the way the room seemed to shrink, the way shadows leaned closer, as if they, too, were listening. Only the boy felt it. And then he spoke. Not with words. Not at first. But with a look. A recognition that whatever she had done, whatever dark thread she had pulled through the fabric of reality, it had changed the rules. And the boy, the silent observer of life's hidden machinery, was no longer just a spectator. He was awake. And once awake, you cannot go back. Tonight, you will see what he saw. You will feel the weight of truths hidden in plain sight. And when it ends, you may never hear the world the same way again. What she did first seemed subtle. A gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of centuries. The way she touched the objects around her, the way she moved through the air, as if gravity itself deferred to her will. It wasn't magic, not the kind told in fairy tales. It was older. It was deliberate. It was the kind of knowledge men have tried to destroy for generations because it makes you dangerous, and dangerous knowledge always terrifies the unprepared. The boy watched. Every shift, every nuance, burned into his memory like fire. And with each flicker of her hand, each whisper of command in the empty room, the air began to betray its true nature. He realized that reality was more pliable than anyone dared admit. He realized that humans were not free. They were conditioned. They were manipulated, controlled, molded by forces that hid in plain sight. And she was a master of that control. He could see the layers. The polite smiles masking fear. The laughter that carried a hint of desperation. The invisible strings tying each person to rituals they didn't even know they followed. And it terrified him, but not enough to silence him. Because fear, when understood, becomes a weapon. And the boy was learning how to wield it. She turned to him then, eyes sharp, measuring. Not with judgment, but recognition. She knew he saw it all. The suppressed truths, the hidden hierarchies, the corruption that oozed from walls, from floors, from whispered histories that no one dared speak aloud. And in that instant, he understood a principle older than kings. Power is not given. Power is taken. And the one who understands the machinery of influence controls everything. And then the first words escaped him. Not a scream. Not a plea. Not a question. But a statement, silent only to everyone else, reverberating in the hidden architecture of the room, in the spaces between what was visible and invisible. He had claimed a space that no one had ever given him. He had entered a domain where secrets live, and he had made himself seen. What she had done was irreversible, and what he had seen was dangerous. Dangerous because it was true. Dangerous because once you see how deep the manipulation runs, you can never forget it. And every man listening right now, every man who has ever felt the pull of forbidden knowledge, is about to step further into that abyss. From that night onward, the boy was no longer just a silent witness drifting through forgotten rooms. He had become something else. Something she hadn't planned for. Something the old texts warned about in cryptic margins and half-erased ink. Because when an observer becomes aware of the system behind reality, the system begins to respond. And sometimes, it pushes back. She sensed it before anyone else. The shift, the disturbance. Men with shallow minds would have mistaken it for coincidence, or mood, or childish rebellion. But she knew better. She had spent years perfecting the subtle architecture of control, small, invisible manipulations that shaped behavior without force. A pause in conversation when she needed dominance. A tilt of her head to shift guilt. A controlled smile to plant self-doubt in the unsuspecting. She had mastered the art of psychological gravity. She pulled people inward, into her orbit, until they couldn't distinguish their thoughts from her influence. But the boy, he did not fall into orbit. He rose above it. He began noticing the hidden rules, the unspoken obedience in others, the rehearsed politeness that wasn't politeness at all but fear dressed in social ritual. He noticed how people's eyes flicked toward her before they answered questions, how their bodies shifted when she entered the room, how their voices softened as if they were negotiating with an unseen judge. Even the house breathed in sync with her presence. The walls groaned differently when she walked. The old wooden floors carried echoes longer than they should. And the boy catalogued everything. He didn't speak it. He internalized it, studied it, understood it at a level most men never reach because most men are too distracted, too conditioned, too preoccupied with comfort to notice the invisible architecture trapping them. But boys who grow up in silence hear what others miss. They detect the currents beneath words, the intentions beneath gestures, the power beneath the facade. She tried to reassert control. Not directly. No truly powerful force ever acts directly. Instead, she used routines, rituals of interaction designed to guide his behavior back into predictable patterns. A gentle touch on the shoulder, a lingering glance, a carefully timed correction, a tone designed to reshape his emotional state. But every move she made taught him more. He learned that control is rarely loud. It is quiet, consistent, disguised as care. It is a psychological trap that feels like safety until you see the hooks. He had seen the hooks. And once you see the hooks, you cannot be owned. The house was not just a house. It was a labyrinth of secrets. Every hallway a corridor of whispered agendas, every locked door a symbol of suppressed truths. And the boy walked through it like a ghost, listening, learning, cataloging. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. Once you see the machinery behind what others accept blindly, you can't unsee it. And the machinery was alive. She moved through it like a conductor orchestrating an invisible symphony. A glance here, a pause there, a word spoken softly, carefully, as though language itself bent to her will. Men and women around her did not obey because they wanted to. They obeyed because they had been trained to respond before they even knew the trigger existed. And the boy recognized the pattern. Every manipulation followed a rhythm. Every suppression carried a signature. And then he saw it, what she truly wanted. Not control over a house. Not dominance over people. She sought something deeper. Submission of consciousness. Ownership of perception. To bend reality, you don't just push on the world. You push on how people see the world. Change perception, and you change action. Change action, and you change destiny. The boy understood instantly. This was no ordinary power. It was a psychological system built over lifetimes, inherited like a virus, hidden in plain sight. Institutions, families, governments, they all followed the same invisible design. Rituals, rewards, fear, repetition. All the levers were there. Most never noticed. Most never realized there were marionettes dancing for someone else's amusement. But he noticed. He saw the levers. He identified the knots. And he began to untangle them quietly, like a surgeon peeling away tissue without bleeding the patient. Every observation sharpened his mind. Every realization stripped away layers of indoctrination that society, family, and authority had buried deep inside him. By the time she realized he wasn't just watching anymore, it was too late. The boy had become the observer of the observer, the predator who knew the hunter's steps, the silent force ready to speak, ready to act, ready to claim insight that few dared to understand. And this is where the world splits. Those who see and those who remain blind. Those who accept the stories fed to them, and those who wake up in the middle of the night, staring at shadows, realizing the truth is not just out there. It's inside every structure, every law, every ritual, every thought you've ever been trained to accept. And the boy, he had woken up. There is a moment in every man's life when reality cracks, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. Most ignore it. They look away, distract themselves, Pretend nothing happened. But the boy, he stared straight into the fracture. And what stared back at him was not the world he thought he lived in, but something older, sharper, and infinitely more intentional. It happened 3 nights after he first witnessed her forbidden gesture. The house had fallen into its usual ritual of uneasy calm, voices low, lights dim, footsteps measured to avoid staring whatever slept in the walls. But she was awake, and activity followed her like a tide pulled by a hidden moon. She entered the forbidden room. No one ever entered that room. Not because it was locked, but because it was understood. A silent agreement enforced not by rules, but by an instinctive dread that pressed down on the soul. A room that felt like a secret buried alive. The boy followed her silently, each step precise, each breath controlled. He could feel something ancient vibrating under the floorboards, something that had waited for decades, maybe centuries, to be acknowledged again. And she unlatched it with the casual confidence of someone who believed she alone had the right. Inside, the room was cold. Not the kind of cold felt on skin. No, it was a deeper cold, a cold of memory, of presence. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects that didn't belong together, relics, fragments, symbols from different ages, different cultures, different buried histories. A secret museum curated by a woman who should never have had access to such knowledge. But she hadn't come for the relics. She approached the far corner, where a single wooden chair sat facing the wall. It was old, far older than anything else in the room. The wood was darkened not by age, but by something else, something that felt like intent. She whispered to it. The boy didn't hear the words. He felt them ripple through the air like invisible claws. The room responded. Objects trembled, shadows lengthened, the temperature dropped. He realized then what she truly was. Not a manipulator, not a strategist, but a keeper, a holder of forbidden inheritance, a practitioner of consciousness rituals lost to history and erased from memory for a reason. And when she turned, her eyes did not reflect the lamplight. They reflected the boy. She had known he would follow her. She had allowed it, because what she was about to do required a witness capable of being transformed, a witness who could not be controlled anymore, but could still be broken. And the boy understood. This was the night everything would change. The air thickened, pressing against the boy's chest, yet he did not retreat. Fear had become a tool, a lens, a kind of currency he could exchange for clarity. He stepped closer as she arranged the objects, each one precise, deliberate, like pieces in a cosmic puzzle no one else was meant to see. Candles flickered, but their flame bent toward her, as if even light obeyed her command. She began the ritual quietly, muttering phrases older than any living memory, syllables that carried weight in the spaces between the known and the hidden. The boy could feel them inside his body, vibrating in rhythm with some forgotten law of the universe. His heart raced, but he remained silent. He had learned the first rule: observation is power. React too soon, and you become prey. React too late, and you become complicit. Then she paused. Her gaze met his, sharp, knowing, unblinking. And he felt it, a subtle tug at his mind, an attempt to bend his awareness to her will. He realized in that moment the full scale of what he was witnessing. Control, true control, is not about force. It is about alignment, about making others bend willingly to the architecture of influence. She had done this countless times, but never with him. He understood why. The boy had not been silent because he was afraid. He had been silent because he had been learning, watching, cataloging. And now, for the first time, he was ready. Ready not to speak, but to see, to understand, to grasp the full scope of the machinery at work. She began again, chanting in the forgotten language, and the room shifted. The walls pulsed, the floor trembled beneath their feet. Shadows danced against surfaces in ways that defied logic. Every object in the room seemed to feed her power, bending the very rules of perception around her. And then, the first sign of the transformation began. It was subtle, a flicker, a distortion in the air around her, a momentary overlap between what was visible and what should not exist. The boy watched as the ritual's intent expanded beyond the room, beyond her presence, into the unseen framework of influence that structured their lives. He realized the danger, the brilliance, and the audacity of it all. And then it happened. The boy's silence broke. Not with words. Not yet. But with a signal. Small, deliberate, unmistakable. A recognition that he had crossed the threshold, that he had entered a realm of knowledge so forbidden, so potent, that it could not be unlearned. And she knew it too. Because once the observer becomes aware, the game changes. The boy felt it first in his mind, a tremor of thought that didn't belong to him. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was recognition, an awareness of a system operating beneath reality itself. Every word she had whispered, every movement she had made, had been designed to teach him without teaching, to show him without showing, to pull him into a truth so forbidden that most would dismiss it as madness. She watched him, measuring, waiting, and the boy realized something crucial. This was never about the ritual. It was never about the objects or the candles or the words. It was about him, about awakening a capacity that had been dormant, buried under layers of silence and observation. She was testing him, seeing if he could survive the exposure to truths too heavy for ordinary minds. And there they were, the forces beyond her, the hidden structures that shaped lives in ways no one admitted aloud. Institutions, hierarchies, traditions, all designed to control, manipulate, and condition. Men and women believed they were free, but they were bound by invisible rules, responding to cues, patterns, and rituals inherited from a past deliberately erased from history. The boy understood why she had performed the act in secret. Because knowledge like this, once spoken aloud, becomes contagious. Once perceived, it cannot be forgotten. Once understood, it changes a person irrevocably. And some systems, some powers, cannot allow that kind of transformation. He felt the first stirrings of a strange power within himself. Awareness sharpened into something tactile, something he could manipulate. The room's shadows, the cadence of her voice, the alignment of the candles, they were no longer just observed phenomena. They were part of a framework he could understand, predict, and, eventually, influence. And yet, a warning echoed through him, unspoken but undeniable. This path was dangerous. Knowledge like this attracts attention. Forces beyond comprehension notice when someone begins to see. Some welcome it. Most hunt it. And he had already stepped into the territory of the hunted. It was then, in that suspended moment, that he realized the true cost. To see the machinery behind reality is to become untouchable, and simultaneously, irreparably vulnerable. Once the mind recognizes the hidden architecture, nothing can return to innocence. Nothing can remain simple. The boy's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, she smiled, not with victory, but with understanding, because she knew he had crossed a threshold few ever do, and the world beyond the room would never be the same for him. The room exhaled, not literally, but in a way that the boy could feel deep in his bones, a shift in energy, a subtle acknowledgement that something ancient had been awakened. He had crossed the line between observer and participant, and the world outside that room had already begun to respond. He noticed it first in the silence of the halls. Footsteps paused when they should have moved. Doors that were never locked shifted as if guided by invisible hands. People walked past him with a strange hesitancy, their eyes darting towards something unseen, their bodies unknowingly aligning with forces they could not name. The boy understood immediately. The hidden structures had noticed him. They did not move openly. They never do. Influence, when it is true and ancient, works in shadows. It whispers through fear, through loyalty, through the invisible threads that bind men and women to patterns they call normal. And now, he was a variable in that system, a disruption. She watched him closely, her expression unreadable, but the boy could sense a shift in her tactics. She no longer guided the ritual for instruction. She guided it for observation. Every glance, every subtle gesture, was a test of his reactions. Every small misalignment in the room, a trembling candle, a shifting shadow, was an experiment to see how he would adapt. He realized something chilling. The boy had thought he was learning the rules, understanding the machinery, gaining power. But the truth was deeper. The machinery had been learning him, watching him, responding, preparing. He felt the first true wave of danger, an almost imperceptible pressure in his mind, like a hand brushing across his thoughts, nudging him toward doubt, toward fear. The room itself seemed alive now, every object a node in a system designed to probe him, to see if he could withstand the exposure. And in that moment, he understood the final rule of forbidden knowledge. Seeing is only the beginning. Surviving what you see is the true challenge. Because once the hidden forces recognize that you are awake, they adapt, they test, they punish. And if you are not prepared, they erase what you have become, leaving only silence in their wake. But the boy did not flinch. Not now. Not ever. He had seen too much. He had learned too much. And the forces that sought to control him had underestimated something they had not predicted. He had learned how to watch them back. The next night, the air carried a different weight. Not the ritual's quiet hum, not the soft rhythm of hidden influence, but a pressure that pressed against the boy's very perception. He could feel it crawling along the edges of his awareness, probing, testing, challenging him. The hidden forces had noticed him fully now, and they were responding with the precision of centuries-old intelligence. She moved among the objects again, not with the careful precision of a teacher, but with the authority of someone commanding a system she had inherited long before he was born. And for the first time, the boy realized she was not alone. The knowledge she wielded was connected to something larger, networks of influence, rituals embedded in history, and powers that did not sleep. He felt the first direct pressure on his consciousness. A thought appeared unbidden in his mind, sharp, invasive, almost cruel. Turn away. You cannot endure this. You are not ready. But the boy knew better. Awareness is a weapon, but only when it is wielded deliberately. To hesitate, to doubt, is to surrender. And surrender was not an option. Not here. Not now. He watched her work, observed the subtle manipulations she enacted on the room itself. Candles shifted, shadows bent unnaturally, objects hummed with invisible intent. Every element of the space carried meaning, an encoded language of influence. And as he observed, he realized something profound. She was not just demonstrating power. She was teaching him how to resist it. The hidden forces tried again. Stronger this time. Thoughts of fear, hesitation, and confusion intruded like phantom hands, attempting to bend his perception to the will of something he could not see. But he held firm. He had learned to watch, to catalogue, to discern the difference between manipulation and truth. And he began to push back, not overtly, but subtly, imperceptibly. It was a silent war of awareness. And the boy was winning. For the first time, she allowed a smile. Not one of triumph, but of recognition. She knew he had crossed another threshold. The boy's silence was no longer ignorance. It was deliberate observation, a shield forged through understanding. And in that silence lay a power that even the hidden forces could not immediately measure. Because true awakening is never loud. It begins quietly, internally, in the spaces between fear and understanding. And once it begins, there is no turning back. By now, the boy had changed. Silence was no longer passive. It had become a lens, a weapon, a method of measuring the invisible currents that ran through the house, through the people, through the hidden architecture of influence itself. And tonight, he began to act. He moved with intention, subtle but deliberate, shifting objects slightly, testing the responsiveness of the room. Candles, once obedient to her will, flickered toward his presence. Shadows, once aligned perfectly to her gestures, hesitated at his approach. He realized that the hidden forces, the systems designed to test, control, and manipulate, had underestimated him. They had treated him as a passive observer, a child to be guided. But he was no longer a child. She watched, her gaze unreadable, as he made the smallest adjustments. A tilt of a chair, a repositioning of a candle, the rearrangement of a relic just slightly out of its intended pattern. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent ripples through the invisible network that governed the space. And those ripples were noticed. A pressure formed in the boy's mind, a test from the hidden forces themselves. Thoughts of doubt, panic, and despair tried to intrude, forcing him to question his own perceptions. Were the shifts real, or just imagined? Were the shadows bending to his will, or had he already been manipulated without realizing it? He smiled quietly, the first real sign of defiance. Because he understood the truth. Observation breeds power, but action confirms it. And every subtle movement he made was not a challenge, but a declaration. He was awake. He was aware. And the forces that sought to control him had no authority here. Not yet. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrow, almost approving. She understood the significance. Few ever reach this stage. Most break long before they have a chance to intervene. But he was different. The boy had internalized the rules of manipulation and perception. He had catalogued the patterns, anticipated the moves, and now, for the first time, he was bending the system to his understanding, if only slightly. And the truth settled in his bones. Once you understand the machinery behind reality, once you learn to move within its invisible rhythms, you are no longer prey. You become a participant, a disruptor, and sometimes, the hunter. The moment he shifted that first relic, the room responded. Not violently, not dramatically, but in ways that spoke of intelligence far beyond the visible. The candles guttered, shadows warped unnaturally, and the air itself seemed to pulse, testing his awareness. He realized immediately, the hidden forces had noticed. His subtle defiance had triggered a response. It was never about punishment. Not yet. These forces operate differently. They test, they probe, they push just enough to see if you will falter. If you hesitate, if you doubt, if you lose your internal compass, the system reclaims you silently, invisibly. And he could feel it, the pressure crawling along the edges of his mind, probing for weakness. She watched, as if measuring not just him, but the reaction of the room, the forces, the unseen observers embedded in the patterns around them. Her expression was unreadable, but the boy felt the acknowledgement. He had crossed a line most never even approach. Most never noticed there was a line at all. And yet, he did not falter. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, intentional. He learned to feel the currents of influence, to anticipate them, to ride their flow rather than resist blindly. The room became a mirror, reflecting his understanding back to him, revealing the hidden systems that had manipulated lives for generations. He could feel them adjusting, recalibrating, attempting to regain dominance, but he had already anticipated their strategies. A sudden flicker of the candlelight revealed something he had not expected, a pattern embedded in the shadows themselves, a signature of the hidden forces, a rhythm he could now decipher. It was like learning a language no one else could read. And with each deciphered symbol, he gained leverage. A subtle nudge here, a slight shift there, a glance that realigned perception. He began influencing the system that had tried to own him. The hidden forces reacted with intensity now. Thoughts intruded, sharper, more aggressive, whispers of doubt, fear, and control. The boy felt the psychological weight like a hand pressing down on his skull. But he had learned something critical. The observer who understands the machinery can anticipate the moves before they arrive. And when you anticipate, you are no longer subject. You are an actor in the system, capable of disruption. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with recognition. The boy had become more than a witness. He was a participant. And the forces that had tried to control him were realizing, slowly, that he would not be controlled. Not anymore. The room shifted again, imperceptibly to anyone else. But the boy felt every pulse, every quiver, every ripple of intent. The hidden forces, confident in their centuries of control, had never encountered a mind like his. Quiet, calculating, precise, immune to fear yet aware of consequence. And now, they were adapting. But he was already ahead. He began to act not as a responder, but as a conductor of the unseen symphony. Small gestures, almost meaningless on the surface, began to produce tangible effects. A candle flickered differently. Shadows stretched or shrank. Air seemed to bend, carrying whispers that were not his but moved at his command. The boy realized he could manipulate the environment, the currents, the hidden architecture itself, not because he had power, but because he had awareness. Awareness is the precursor to mastery. She watched him with a quiet intensity, her eyes calculating, searching, measuring. She had awakened him, yes, but she had not expected him to understand the system so quickly, so completely. Most fail at the first threshold. Most never learn to anticipate the hidden currents. But he had, and that made him dangerous, not just to her, but to the architecture she served. And then, for the first time, the boy felt something entirely new, influence over the forces themselves. Thoughts that were meant to intrude were deflected, bent, redirected. Pressure that sought to unbalance him was absorbed and repurposed, becoming a tool to probe the forces back. He had stepped into the predator's position, though quietly, almost invisibly. The danger increased. The hidden systems had begun to retaliate. Shadows deepened, objects trembled, and the air grew thick with the weight of unseen intent. But he remained calm. He understood something few ever learn. Confrontation with the unseen is not about brute force. It is about timing, perception, and strategic engagement. And she, standing in the room that had become a crucible of awareness, finally nodded. Not in surrender, not in fear, but in recognition. The boy had crossed the point of no return. He was no longer just learning. He was challenging, testing, manipulating. He was awake in a way that could not be undone. The hidden forces reacted violently now, like currents against a newly anchored ship. But the boy, having learned the rhythm, adjusted, navigated, and responded. He was no longer prey. He was a participant. He was a disruptor. And for the first time, the balance of power had shifted. The hidden forces recoiled, subtly but unmistakably. They had never encountered a mind capable of perceiving their architecture and responding in kind. The boy had become more than a witness. He had become a destabilizing presence. And in their ancient, calculated way, they knew it. He moved quietly through the room, every gesture precise, every step calculated. Shadows danced differently around him now, bending not just to his presence but to his intent. Candles responded to the minutest shifts in his attention. Objects, once innate, now carried subtle messages, vibrations, signals, reflections of his own understanding sent outward like ripples across a pond. He was beginning to manipulate not just the environment, but the rules themselves. She watched from the corner, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. She had awakened him, yes, but even she could not have predicted the speed of his transformation. Most minds fracture under the weight of such forbidden awareness. Most succumb to doubt, fear, or the subtle pressures of invisible authority. But he did not. He had learned to harness observation as armor, and now, as a tool of influence. The room began to whisper, or perhaps it was the boy's mind projecting. Either way, he understood. The forces were testing him, probing for weaknesses, seeking fractures in his perception that could be exploited. But he had already anticipated this. He had learned their rhythm, their timing, their methods of intrusion. Every mental nudge, every psychic prod, he deflected, redirected, or absorbed, converting it into insight, into knowledge, into leverage. And then he did something no one could have expected. He sent back a subtle signal of his own, a shift in intention so precise that the hidden forces faltered, even if only momentarily. The room, attuned to eons of hierarchy and obedience, hesitated. And in that hesitation, the boy glimpsed a truth that would change him forever. Every system of control, no matter how ancient, has its weakness. Every force, no matter how hidden, is vulnerable to awareness, to understanding, to deliberate action. The smile on her face widened slightly. She had known the boy would awaken, but she had not known the magnitude. The quiet observer had become a participant. The manipulated had become the manipulator. And in that quiet, unseen victory, the balance of power shifted, not entirely, but irreversibly. The room held its breath. Not literally, but in a way that the boy could feel in every nerve, every pulse, every microsecond of perception. He had learned to read the currents of unseen influence, to anticipate the subtle manipulations of forces that had shaped generations. And now, the time had come for a different kind of engagement, a symbolic act that would mark the threshold of his transformation. She stepped aside, almost ceremoniously, revealing an object he had not noticed before. A mirror, tall and unadorned, placed in the center of the room. Its surface was polished, but it was not a reflection in the ordinary sense. No, this mirror captured more than light. It reflected intention, will, awareness. It was a vessel for perception, a tool for testing the mind, a conduit for those who sought forbidden understanding. The boy approached. Every instinct screamed caution. Every hidden current whispered warnings. And yet, he moved forward without hesitation. Because he knew the rule now. The observer becomes powerful when he acknowledges himself in the machinery of control. The mirror was not a tool of vanity. It was a tool of awakening. When he gazed into it, the first shock hit. He saw himself, yes, but not as he believed he was. He saw the observer, the cataloger, the silent learner. He saw the reactions of the hidden forces to his presence. He saw the threads of influence, the subtle manipulations of the world, and he saw how they bent around him. For the first time, he understood the full scope of what he had been witnessing, and it terrified him. And yet, he did not falter. He raised his hand and touched the mirror. Not in curiosity, not in fear, but with intention. And the reflection responded, not by mirroring him, but by revealing the hidden structures beneath him, the psychological architecture that had shaped not just the room, not just the house, but generations of unseen influence. The ritual was no longer hers alone. The boy had become an active participant. By engaging with the mirror, he declared his awareness, his agency, his willingness to step into knowledge most men would die without seeing. He understood fully. Once you see the invisible levers, once you grasp the architecture of control, you are changed forever. She nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of what had occurred. The ritual had worked, but not in the way she had intended. He had awakened. He had seen. And he had begun to claim power that even the hidden forces had not expected him to hold. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed the mirror was heavier than anything the boy had felt. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as though the hidden forces were gathering, observing, calculating. He realized in that moment that awakening is never solitary. The system notices. It responds. It tests. And tonight, he was about to face the first true test of his awareness. The shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching toward him, curling around the edges of the room. A whisper, low and fragmented, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, threading into his consciousness. You are not ready. You cannot endure this. He recognized the tone immediately. Ancient, authoritative, deliberate. The forces behind her knowledge had been watching, and now they sought to measure him, to probe for weaknesses. But the boy had changed. Observation had become action. Silence had become power. And awareness had become armor. He stood firm, letting the currents of influence wash over him without resistance, cataloging every fluctuation, every vibration, every subtle pulse of intent. The hidden forces were testing him, and he met them on his own terms. Then came the first overt manifestation. Objects in the room trembled as though alive. Candles flickered violently, shadows twisted unnaturally, and a pressure pressed on his mind, attempting to fracture his focus, to disrupt the delicate balance of perception he had worked so hard to achieve. It was a challenge, and he felt it in every fiber of his being. The system wanted to assert dominance. He did not flinch. He breathed deliberately, anchoring himself in awareness. Every movement he had catalogued over nights of silent observation now became instinct. He counted the pressure subtly, redirecting the currents with intention, bending the invisible architecture without breaking it. And for the first time, he realized the depth of his own capability. He could manipulate not just the environment, not just the objects or shadows, but the very forces that had sought to dominate him. She watched, eyes narrowed, as the invisible struggle unfolded. He was no longer the student. He was a participant, an adversary, a mind capable of engaging with forces designed to overwhelm ordinary consciousness. And as the room pulsed, shifted, and strained against his will, he felt an exhilarating truth settle deep in his bones. The hunter had become the observed, and now he could fight back. The hidden forces would not relent, but neither would he. The room convulsed with silent intent. Shadows twisted, objects trembled, and the air seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a consciousness older than the boy could name. The hidden forces, sensing defiance, tried to dominate him with subtle but relentless pressure. Thoughts intruded unbidden. Fear clawed at his mind. Hesitation tried to seep in. But he had anticipated this. He moved deliberately, not with force, but with awareness. Every adjustment of his gaze, every tilt of his head, every measured breath became a lever against the currents trying to bend him. He was no longer merely responding. He was redirecting. He was shaping the invisible architecture, sending ripples through the forces that sought to crush him. The boy realized a terrifying truth. The hidden powers, for all their sophistication, operated within patterns, within predictable rhythms. Once you understand the pattern, once you perceive the structure, you can exploit it. He began to manipulate the subtle pulses, nudging the system back on itself. Pressure aimed at him bent subtly, redirected, creating openings he could exploit. The forces intended to destabilize him, but he transformed their assault into insight, into leverage, into control. She watched quietly, her face unreadable. He had crossed the threshold. No longer a student of observation, he was a practitioner of influence. Every subtle motion became a statement of power. Every shadow that danced against him was not a threat but a dialogue. He had learned to read the language of the unseen, and with comprehension came authority. Then came the first overt crack in their dominance. A relic trembled violently, a shadow recoiled, and the faintest pulse of dissonance rippled through the room. The hidden forces had underestimated him. They had assumed passivity, silence, fear, but he had none. He had anticipation, calculation, and now, the ability to bend them against themselves. The boy allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The system had revealed its weakness. Every architecture, no matter how ancient, has points of leverage. Awareness is the key, and he had claimed it. She nodded slowly, the faintest trace of approval in her gaze. He had begun to move beyond instruction. He had begun to challenge the hidden, and the night, thick with shadows and unseen pressure, had become his crucible and his proving ground. Fear is a weapon, and the hidden forces wielded it like a scalpel. It crept into the boy's mind in whispers, subtle nudges of doubt and hesitation. But now, he understood something most never do. Fear is not a signal to retreat, it is a signal to awaken. Every quiver of apprehension, every pulse of uncertainty, was raw energy, waiting to be harnessed. He embraced it. He let it flow through him, not as a weakness, but as fuel. The pressure that had once sought to bend him now sharpened his perception. The shadows, the tremors of the objects, the subtle intrusions of thought, they all became tools. Fear became rhythm. Fear became clarity. Fear became power. She observed quietly, her eyes fixed, yet her presence no longer commanding. She had ignited the spark, yes, but now he stoked the flame himself. He was no longer guided. He was choosing his path within the architecture of influence. Every step he took was deliberate. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle motion was infused with intent. He had learned to tame the environment, the hidden currents, and even fear itself into instruments of mastery. And the hidden forces recoiled. Not completely. They are patient, eternal, but enough for the boy to realize that awareness and precision could bend even the ancient systems that had shaped generations. Objects trembled when he focused on them. Shadows shifted at his gaze. The currents of influence, designed to overwhelm, now answered his attention, subtly obeying the rhythm of his perception. He understood fully, viscerally, that knowledge alone does not liberate. Awareness alone does not empower. True mastery requires transformation, the alchemy of fear into instinct, hesitation into action, observation into authority. And in that realization, he became more than a participant in the unseen system. He became a node of influence, a force the hidden powers would have to account for. The room itself seemed to acknowledge it. The subtle tremors quieted. The shadows held their shape. Even the faint pressure in his mind withdrew slightly, as if recognizing his command. And he felt it, a dangerous, intoxicating awareness that he could no longer unlearn. Once fear becomes power, once silence becomes mastery, there is no retaining to the world of the ordinary. She nodded again, a faint smile of acknowledgement. The boy had crossed another threshold. The awakening was complete, not just of observation, but of active, instinctive engagement with the hidden. The air thickened suddenly, heavier than it had ever been. The shadows no longer merely danced, they lunged, twisted unnaturally, converging toward him with purpose. The hidden forces had recognized his growing power, and now they responded as predators do, not subtly, but with calculated aggression. They intended to overwhelm, to fracture, to reclaim the mind that had begun to slip from their control. The boy felt the pressure immediately. Thoughts not his own tried to push, to bend his awareness, to drown him in doubt and panic. Each intrusion carried the weight of centuries of manipulation, designed to break the unprepared. Most men would have crumpled under it, but he did not. He inhaled deeply, letting the intensity flow through him instead of against him. Fear was no longer a weapon against him. It was fuel, sharpening his instincts. Every gesture he had learned in silence now became reflex. He shifted slightly, repositioned his gaze, and subtly altered the currents of influence around him. Shadows recoiled where they had intended to strike. Candles flickered along his chosen path rather than collapsing into chaos. Every intruding thought was redirected, absorbed, transformed into insight. The hidden forces found their attacks neutralized, their strategies reflected back with precision they had never encountered. She watched silently from the corner, her eyes glinting with recognition. She had awakened him, yes, but she had underestimated the speed of his transformation. The boy had become more than awake. He had become a participant capable of engaging, anticipating, and neutralizing forces that had ruled unseen for generations. And then came the moment of reckoning. One shadow detached itself completely from the walls, moving with intent toward him. The room itself seemed to pulse as though it were alive, preparing to enforce the dominance the hidden powers demanded. But the boy acted with instinctive precision. He shifted his attention, aligned his intent, and the shadow hesitated. It twisted, recoiled, faltered under the weight of his awareness. He understood it fully. This was no longer just survival. This was mastery. The forces that had sought to control him had revealed themselves, and he had learned to bend them, not through brute strength, but through perception, awareness, and calculated intent. The predator had met the predator, and now the rules had changed. She nodded once more, faint but deliberate. The boy had passed the first true trial, and he knew, deep in his bones, that the path ahead would only grow darker, deeper, and more dangerous. The room had become a crucible, charged with intention, perception, and invisible conflict. Shadows still lingered, objects still trembled, and the air itself seemed to weigh on every thought. But the boy no longer reacted. He moved deliberately, measuredly, each gesture carrying intent that reshaped the currents around him. He began to assert himself in ways subtle yet undeniable. A tilt of a candle, a shift of a relic, a deliberate pause in his gaze. These small actions produced immediate, rippling effects. Shadows twisted differently, pressure lifted slightly, and even the intrusive thoughts faltered as if questioning their own authority. For the first time, he could sense the hidden forces bending in response to him, not the other way around. She observed quietly, almost silently, as if witnessing the birth of a new kind of power. The boy had gone beyond mere awareness. He had moved into influence, subtly recalibrating the unseen system that had sought to dominate him. And the forces themselves reacted unpredictably, confused by the shift in control. He understood something critical. Influence is less about confrontation and more about architecture. Move the right piece in the right rhythm, and the system begins to obey. The hidden forces, designed to overwhelm, could be manipulated if one could see the structure behind them. And he could see. He experimented deliberately. A shadow recoiled, and he allowed it to reform in a pattern more favorable to him. A relic trembled, and he guided it subtly into alignment with his intent. The currents of pressure, meant to destabilize him, now flowed along pathways he controlled. Every action was quiet, imperceptible to an untrained eye, but monumental in effect. And she, standing at the periphery of the room, recognized the significance. The boy had become a node of influence, a participant capable of shaping the hidden forces themselves. This was no longer about survival or awareness. It was about transformation. The observer had become the architect, the silent presence now commanding ripples through the unseen. He paused, surveying the room. Every object, every shadow, every pressure point had responded. He had not simply endured. He had imposed a subtle order over chaos. And in that quiet moment of symbolic dominance, he understood the truth. The hidden forces, for all their history, for all their sophistication, could be engaged, understood, and, if one dared, their patterns could be reshaped. And he dared. The room itself seemed to pulse with awareness, responding to the boy's every move. Shadows stretched and recoiled, objects vibrated with subtle energy, and the invisible currents of influence rippled like water around a stone he had dropped. He had moved beyond reaction. He was now shaping the environment itself. The hidden forces were no longer simply testing him. They were responding, recalibrating, adapting to his presence. He could feel it, the ultimate mechanism, the central pulse behind the architecture of control, the source that orchestrated the subtle manipulations of thought, fear, and perception. It was not visible, not tangible, but it existed in every flicker of candlelight, every shadow, every tremor of air. It was the system itself, aware, deliberate, ancient, and it had taken notice of him. The boy approached it not with fear, but with understanding. He had catalogued its patterns, learned its rhythms, and felt the subtle weaknesses hidden within its structure. He knew that the ultimate challenge was not to fight it directly. There was no brute force here, but to engage it, to meet it with clarity, precision, and intent. He moved deliberately through the room, each gesture resonating with awareness. Candles flickered as he passed, shadows shifted to accommodate his presence, and the air itself seemed to pulse in response. The hidden forces pressed back, subtle but insistent, probing for hesitation, doubt, or fear. But he had none. His mind was clear, his perception acute, and his intent deliberate. And then he acted. Not with words, not with force, but with awareness itself. Every movement, every breath, every glance was calibrated to engage the ultimate mechanism, to test its boundaries, to reveal its vulnerabilities. The room responded immediately. Shadows twisted unnaturally, objects trembled with deliberate resonance, and the subtle pressure that had always sought to dominate him bent under the weight of his comprehension. She watched silently, recognizing the magnitude of what had occurred. The boy was no longer simply participating in the system. He was challenging it. And in that moment, he understood the most dangerous truth of all. Once you perceive the hidden architecture, once you learn to engage the ultimate mechanism, you can no longer return to ignorance. You have stepped into power that demands awareness, courage, and mastery. The system had noticed him, and for the first time, it had reason to fear. The air was electric, charged with anticipation and silent recognition. The hidden forces had pressed, tested, and probed. But now, for the first time, the boy was no longer responding. He was initiating. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle shift of his body sent ripples through the architecture of control, bending currents that had never been bent before. He moved toward the center of the room, where the mirror, the conduit of awareness and reflection, stood. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though sensing his intent. This was not merely a reflection anymore. It was the threshold, the interface between perception and power, the point where understanding becomes mastery. He extended his hand and touched the mirror deliberately. The room responded immediately. Shadows recoiled, tremors in the object ceased, and the subtle pressures in his mind shifted in alignment with his will. He was no longer merely perceiving the forces. He was reshaping them. The hidden system, for all its complexity and ancient wisdom, had revealed a weakness. Once influence is understood, it can be engaged, redirected, and even controlled. She observed silently, her eyes narrow, her expression almost unreadable, but he could feel the acknowledgement in her presence. He had done what few could. He had turned observation into action, passivity into mastery, fear into power. He had begun to impose his rhythm on the hidden architecture. And in that moment, something profound occurred. The currents that had pressed against him, that had sought to fracture his mind, now flowed in harmony with his intent. The room exhaled, shadows stilled, and even the subtle whispers of the hidden forces seemed to pause, observing him, recognizing him. He had crossed a threshold, the first symbolic victory. He understood the magnitude. The forces that had shaped generations of unseen influence had been disrupted, subtly but undeniably. He had moved from witness to participant, from observer to manipulator, from potential prey to emerging power. And the mirror reflected not just his image, but his transformation. Silent, deliberate, dangerous. She stepped back, letting him occupy the center of the space, as if acknowledging that the boy was no longer merely under her guidance. He was now part of the system, and yet, in a profound way, he was beyond it. The hidden forces had been challenged, and he had won. The room settled after his symbolic victory, but the calm was deceptive. The hidden forces, ancient and patient, were never truly defeated, they only adapt. Subtle currents returned, quieter this time, but sharper, more insidious. Thoughts began to intrude again, whispers in the edges of his mind, probing for cracks. Fear, doubt, hesitation, they all resurfaced, disguised as ordinary mental noise. The boy sensed it immediately. This was not the same challenge as before. This was strategy, precision, a test of his mastery rather than brute force. The forces had recognized his transformation and were now probing for weaknesses he didn't yet know he possessed. But he had learned the first rule of engagement: awareness is armor, and perception is a weapon. He moved carefully, deliberately, observing the smallest fluctuations in the room. Candles flickered against his intent. Shadows shifted in patterns that betrayed underlying strategies. Every object, every tremor, every subtle pressure was a signal. He catalogued them silently, using the force's own mechanisms against them, bending currents, redirecting pressure, absorbing intrusion. She watched from the corner, her expression unreadable, yet her presence was a subtle acknowledgement. He had crossed threshold few ever reach, and the forces themselves had no choice but to escalate. What came next would not be subtle. It would not be gentle. It would test the limits of his awareness, his instinct, and his growing mastery. And yet, the boy did not flinch. He had begun to understand a critical truth. Influence is like water. Pressure, no matter how intense, can be redirected. A system, no matter how ancient, has vulnerabilities that only reveal themselves to the observant. And he was watching, seeing, and calculating. The first overt sign of retaliation appeared in the mirror itself. Its surface rippled unnaturally, as though the hidden forces were attempting to communicate, manipulate, or intimidate through it. The shadows grew darker, more assertive. The air became thicker, heavier, pressing against his mind in waves. And he felt it, an almost predatory awareness, a consciousness that sought to bend him once again. But he smiled quietly, almost imperceptibly. He had already transformed fear into instinct, observation into mastery, and silence into power. And now, the hidden forces would learn the first lesson of engagement with a mind that had awakened. You cannot control what refuses to be owned. The pressure intensified, but the boy did not flinch. He had learned the rhythm of the unseen currents, the subtle patterns of intrusion, the language of influence that most never perceive. And now, he began to respond, not with brute force, not with fear, but with deliberate strategy. He shifted his attention, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Candles relined, shadows recoiled, and the air pulsed in response to his intent. Every movement, every glance, every tiny gesture became a lever, bending the hidden currents in ways they had not anticipated. The forces that had sought to overwhelm him were now subtly diverted, their pressure redirected, their own strategies used against them. She observed quietly, knowing that what he was doing required more than perception. It required understanding the architecture of control at its deepest level. Most minds could never do this. Most would crumble under the weight of the unseen. But he was no longer ordinary. He had become something else, a node of influence within the system, capable of subtle but undeniable impact. The mirror, once a conduit of observation, now reflected more than his image. It reflected the disruption he was causing in the hidden currents themselves. Shadows twisted unnaturally, objects trembled as if alive, and the subtle whispers of thought intrusion faltered. The forces were adjusting, recalibrating, responding to him instead of the other way around. He understood fully. The hidden powers were adaptive, patient, relentless, but not invincible. Every system has leverage points. Every architecture has vulnerabilities. By observing deeply, engaging deliberately, and acting strategically, he had begun to tame the unseen machinery back upon itself. The first wave of retaliation had become the first wave of advantage. And she nodded, the faintest trace of acknowledgement breaking through her stoic demeanor. He had moved beyond observation, beyond mastery of self. He had begun mastering the unseen, subtly, invisibly, irreversibly. The room pulsed with quiet acknowledgement. The hidden forces had recognized a new variable, a mind that could anticipate, respond, and disrupt. And the boy knew, in his bones, that the game had changed. The hunter had become a disruptor, and the system itself had no choice but to adapt to him. The room seemed quieter now, but it was a deceptive calm. The first waves of resistance had been absorbed, redirected, and turned back. But the hidden forces were patient, ancient, and adaptive. They were preparing the next test, one far subtler, far more insidious. A deeper layer of influence, previously hidden, began to stay. It was not physical, not immediately perceptible. It was embedded in the currents themselves, a consciousness of patterns and intentions older than memory. The boy felt it, faint at first, like a tremor beneath the surface of thought. It pressed against him not with fear or panic, but with subtle suggestion, nudging perception, probing for hesitation, weakness, or arrogance. This layer was not reactive, it was proactive, anticipating his moves before he could act. It was a challenge that would require more than instinct. It required strategy, understanding, and complete awareness. She stepped closer, her presence deliberate but restrained, as if acknowledging the depth of what was about to unfold. She had guided him this far. awakened him, tested him. But even she could not predict the outcome of this next phase. He had become unpredictable, and unpredictability is the ultimate challenge to control. The boy moved deliberately, breathing slowly, anchoring himself in observation. He could feel the currents of the hidden system converging, subtle but unmistakable. Thoughts that were not his own pressed at the edges of his mind, trying to influence perception, bend judgment, and fracture awareness. He allowed them to come, cataloging each pulse, each rhythm, each intrusion, then redirecting them back with calculated precision. The mirror, ever the conduit of reflection and understanding, shimmered faintly as he passed. Its surface now reflected not just the room, not just himself, but the deeper currents of influence he had begun to perceive. For the first time, he could see the architecture behind the architecture, the layer of hidden forces that orchestrated everything else. And he understood, to master the unseen, one must confront the deepest currents directly, without hesitation. He paused, gazing into the mirror, feeling the subtle pressure increase, and knew that the next action he took would define his transformation. He could no longer remain a witness, a participant, or even a disruptor of the surface currents. To truly awaken, he must engage the hidden, confront the ultimate layer, and bend it, not entirely, but enough to claim his own authority within it. The challenge had arrived, and he was ready. The air thickened, almost solid with intent. The hidden layer pressed against him now, relentless but subtle, a force older than memory, adaptive, deliberate, testing not just his awareness but his very perception of reality. This was no longer about observation, no longer about subtle manipulation. This was the ultimate test. Could he engage a consciousness that had orchestrated generations of unseen influence without breaking, without faltering? He took a deliberate step toward the mirror. Its surface pulsed faintly, reflecting not just light, not just his image, but intention itself. This was the interface, the nexus where perception meets power, where awareness meets mastery. And as he stood before it, he felt the currents converge around him, probing, twisting, pressing. Every thought he had, every instinct he had sharpened, every lesson he had learned, it all culminated in this single moment. The hidden forces struck subtly at first, embedding doubt and hesitation into the edges of his mind. Thoughts appeared unbidden. You are not ready. You cannot endure this. Turn back, or be consumed. The boy recognized the tactic immediately. Fear is the first tool of control, and he had learned to transform fear into instinct. He allowed the pressure, cataloged it, and transformed it into focus, clarity, and action. He raised his hand, not in defiance, not in aggression, but in deliberate engagement. The mirror responded, rippling as though sensing his intent, its surface reflecting not only his form but the currents of influence that had sought to shape him. He could feel the hidden layer testing every instinct, every reaction, every ounce of perception he possessed. But now, for the first time, he acted preemptively. Every subtle shift, every blink, every breath was a signal, a counterforce, a strategic realignment of the currents. And then it yielded. Not completely, not in surrender, but it bent. Subtly, imperceptibly, almost unbelievably, the currents aligned with his intent, acknowledging his mastery. The hidden layer had recognized the boy not merely as an observer, not as a participant, not as a disruptor, but as a mind capable of engagement at its own level. She stepped closer, silent, her eyes betraying awe. He had not just survived the ultimate test, he had begun to master it. And in that instant, the rules of engagement shifted. The system, ancient and precise, had been challenged, and the boy had prevailed. The room exhaled, though no one else could hear it. Shadows settled differently, objects aligned with a subtle new rhythm, and the currents of influence that had once pressed against him now pulsed in quiet acknowledgement. The boy stood at the center, aware of what had just occurred, feeling the full weight of transformation. He had not merely survived. He had engaged, understood, and subtly reshaped the hidden forces themselves. She stepped closer, placing the mirror between them. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting more than light, reflecting intention, awareness, and power. He gazed into it, and for the first time, saw the boy he had been, the silent observer, the hesitant participant. And then he saw the boy he had become, alert, deliberate, unflinching, aware of forces most men never even suspect. It was time for a symbolic act, a ritual of recognition. Not for her, not for the forces, but for him. A gesture to cement the transformation, to mark the line between the world of ignorance and the world of awareness. He raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, toward the mirror. This was more than touch. It was acknowledgement. It was alignment. It was declaration. I see. I understand. I claim what knowledge allows me to claim. And now, to solidify this awakening, the boy understood something deeper, a practice of engagement that connects consciousness, intent, and the hidden system itself. To anchor transformation, he needed affirmation, external and internal, symbolic and deliberate. And you, watching, must participate. If you understand even a fraction of what is unfolding, comment twice below. I am awake. I see the currents. Say it, write it, affirm it. Twice. Do not hesitate. This is the key to locking in your perception, to anchoring the transformation within yourself. The system notices those who engage with awareness, and by declaring it aloud, you anchor your own readiness to perceive and act. This is no ordinary engagement. It is a threshold, a gateway. You participate not because it is simple, but because awakening is a choice, and choice is the first act of power. The boy has crossed the line. Now, it is your turn to acknowledge the currents, to recognize the forces in play, and to commit yourself to seeing what most will never understand. Once you do, the subtle alignment begins. Awareness deepens. Observation transforms into mastery, and the path, dangerous and forbidden, opens before you. The room felt alive now, not with fear, not with pressure, but with potential. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every subtle tremor in the air was a language he had learned to read, a rhythm he had learned to interpret. The hidden forces had shifted. They no longer pressed against him. They flowed around him, reacting to his intent rather than controlling it. He stepped deliberately through the space, each movement a conversation with the unseen. Objects realigned, shadows bent subtly, and the currents of influence rippled according to his perception. He was no longer merely surviving the hidden patterns. He was engaging them, testing them, reshaping them from within. And in doing so, he could perceive the most insidious layer yet, the patterns of corruption embedded across generations, the subtle manipulations that dictated faith, loyalty, and obedience in ways men never questioned. She remained silent, a shadow in the corner, watching the boy navigate a system that had never faced such awareness. Most minds would have fractured at this stage. Most would have become lost in the subtle loops of control, trapped by invisible levers they could not name. But he had crossed thresholds too profound to falter. He saw the threads, the architecture of manipulation, and for the first time, he understood how to influence it deliberately. The hidden layer pressed subtly, attempting a final test, subtle distortions of perception, whispers of self-doubt, fleeting images of failure, all intended to fracture his focus. But he did not flinch. He catalogued, analyzed, and redirected the currents, bending the invisible architecture just enough to render the test ineffective. Each intrusion became insight. Each manipulation became leverage. And then he acted with deliberate intent. He aligned himself with the currents, not to dominate blindly, but to expose the patterns themselves, revealing the hidden agendas, the systemic corruption, the structures designed to control perception and obedience across generations. For the first time, the system was visible in its entirety, a lattice of power, manipulation, and secrecy. She stepped back, almost imperceptibly, a nod of recognition passing between them. He had done what no ordinary mind could. He had perceived the entire architecture of control, engaged it directly, and begun to reshape its subtle, insidious patterns. And the boy understood the final truth of this phase. To confront hidden forces is to see them fully, to engage them deliberately, and to wield awareness as a weapon. The current shifted again, heavier now, more deliberate. The hidden forces had revealed their final layer, the agenda that had guided generations of manipulation, fear, and obedience. It was no longer subtle. The architecture of control was visible to him, a lattice of influence spanning centuries, designed to keep men silent, compliant, and unaware. And now he saw it all, crystal clear. The patterns of power, the mechanisms of fear, the psychological chains forged long before he had been born. She watched, silent, as he absorbed it. Most would collapse here. Most would turn away, overwhelmed by the scope of hidden intent, by the weight of secrets that had been buried deliberately, invisibly, for the sake of control. But he did not. He had prepared himself through observation, through transformation, through mastery of the currents that most could never perceive. The boy understood something critical. Knowledge alone is insufficient. Awareness alone is insufficient. True power comes when perception meets deliberate action. And now he had both. He could see the system, navigate it, manipulate it subtly, and begin to fracture it from within. The mirror reflected more than his image now. It reflected the hidden currents of the system, the webs of corruption, the architecture of control that had sought to dominate not just him, but countless others who had never awakened. He understood fully. The agenda was not just personal, it was systemic. It was an inherited mechanism designed to shape men into obedient participants, silent observers of their own lives. He raised his hand toward the mirror deliberately, not in fear, not in hesitation, not in awe, but with authority. And as he did, he felt the currents respond, bending, aligning, acknowledging. The hidden system had met a mind that understood it fully, that engaged it deliberately, and that refused to be owned. And in that moment, the boy, and anyone who had dared to awaken, became a node of influence within the architecture itself. She nodded, faint but deliberate, a recognition of what had been achieved. He had not just survived the hidden agenda. He had understood it, engaged it, and claimed mastery over the first layers of its influence. And now, the ultimate reckoning was at hand, to decide whether to remain a participant, a disruptor, or a master of the system itself. The room pulsed with awareness, charged with the weight of the unseen currents he now commanded. The hidden forces, ancient and patient, tested him still, probing for hesitation, doubt, weakness. But the boy no longer faltered. Every movement, every breath, every glance had become a lever, a tool to bend the system subtly to his intent. He was no longer reacting. He was orchestrating. He began to move deliberately through the architecture of influence itself. Shadows shifted as he passed, objects realigned subtly, and the currents of pressure and manipulation flowed along paths he controlled. He could feel the hidden forces adjusting, recalibrating to his presence, acknowledging him as a new variable, a participant capable of disruption and subtle dominance. The mirror reflected his transformation, not just the boy he had become, but the layers of control he now understood and could manipulate. He had moved from silent observer to awakened participant, and now to orchestrator. Each pulse of influence, each whisper of thought intrusion, was met with deliberate engagement, redirected, and transformed into leverage. She watched silently, her expression betraying the faintest trace of awe. He had transcended every expectation. The hidden system itself recognized a new power, a mind capable of perceiving, anticipating, and subtly guiding currents that had governed generations. The boy had become a force within the architecture, no longer confined by its limitations. And then he understood the ultimate truth, the most dangerous realization of all. To master the hidden system is not simply to bend its forces, it is to see its intent, its agenda, and its weaknesses, and to wield that knowledge deliberately. The currents of influence were not just tools, they were instruments of power, obedience, and liberation, depending on who held mastery. The boy raised his hand, deliberately, over the center of the room. Shadows aligned, objects shifted, and the air itself seemed to bend in acknowledgement. The hidden forces had met a mind that refused domination, that engaged deliberately, and that now exercised authority over the first layers of control. The system recognized it, recalibrated, and, for the first time, deferred. He had completed the transformation. No longer silent, no longer passive, no longer merely a participant. He had become the orchestrator, the subtle master, the force capable of reshaping the unseen. And with that, the final revelation waited, dark, inevitable, and almost incomprehensible. The room was still now, but it thrummed with quiet intelligence, alive with currents that had once sought to dominate him. The boy stood at the center, aware of every shadow, every tremor, every hidden pulse. He had seen the system, engaged it, and subtly bent it to his intent. And now, the final truth revealed itself, not through words, not through fear, not through spectacle, but in the cold clarity of understanding. He realized the forces he had faced were not merely external. They were the architecture within every human mind, the patterns of control, the inherited obedience, the subtle manipulations of society, history, and perception. Every law, every institution, every silent expectation had been a layer in the same machinery he now commanded. The system of influence extended far beyond this room, far beyond the mirror, far beyond her. It was everywhere, woven into the world itself. And yet, he was no longer subject to it. He had transformed fear into instinct, observation into mastery, and silence into authority. He understood the truth that most men never glimpse. The hidden currents that manipulate the world are only as strong as the minds that fail to perceive them. Awareness is the true power, and he now wielded it. She watched from the edge, her expression finally revealing acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps a hint of fear. He had crossed thresholds few ever approach. He had engaged forces designed to shape generations and emerged not only intact but empowered, a node of influence within the very system that had once sought to dominate him. The final secret, the most dangerous knowledge of all, crystallized in his mind. The world is not run by what is visible. It is run by patterns, by perception, by subtle structures of control that most never perceive. And those who awaken to them are not merely observers, they become architects, disruptors, and wielders of influence. But this knowledge comes at a price. Once you see it, once you understand it, you can never unsee it. You carry the weight, the awareness, the responsibility, and the power. He stepped back from the mirror, no longer the boy who had never spoken. He had become the force that sees, the mind that understands, the presence that influences. The hidden currents had been revealed. The system had been engaged. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of those who awaken, that nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for those who dared to perceive, and not for the forces that had once believed themselves untouchable. The secret was out. The currents were no longer invisible. And now, the world would feel the ripple of a mind that refused to be controlled.